Welcome back to our study series on healing and wholeness. Last week, Paula Gooder and I were talking a little bit about some of these situations we encounter where it seems that healing hasn't come. We talked about Paul and his thorn in the flesh. We looked at the image of Jacob, who after his encounter with God went away limping, and how we have to somehow integrate the reality of continued suffering, continued unhealedness within our vision for healing and for wholeness. And we're going to talk this week a little bit about the cross and the resurrection and how that pattern of dying and rising fits into our understanding of healing. And Paula, there's that famous phrase in Isaiah about by his wounds we are healed. And interestingly, that's the wounds, not the resurrection, as it were, which is part of our healing. How do we begin to understand that?
Well, it's just one of the most profound mysteries about Christ. Because often we just love to rush to the happy ending.
Yeah.
You know, we love to be just the Easter people, which is where we can celebrate the resurrection and new life and everything's going to be fine and wonderful and peaceful and glorious. And what Christ's life regularly reminds us of is that truth can only exist when you bring death and resurrection together. They're the two sides of the same coin. And one of the really crucial things is it is in the dying and the rising that the healing can be found. So yes, we are healed by his wounds. But of course, if Christ had just died, then the salvation would have some lack in it as well. Because a Jesus who was dead would have much less impact on us in terms of salvation than a Jesus who died and rose. And one of our challenges as Christians, which is the thing I think we regularly struggle to get our head around, is what does it mean to be people who are now in Christ? And as people who are in Christ, we live out both the death and the resurrection of Jesus in our lives.
And if we go to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, and we're into the resurrection language at that point, I mean, it's quite clear from Paul's teaching that it's through the resurrection that we may, for example, appropriate forgiveness, which is part of our healing. So the resurrection is central, but we're saying it's the dying and the rising together, which is the pathway into healing. And of course, without going into all the theories of atonement, I mean, the language is there that it's through the cross that forgiveness comes. It's through the cross that we are saved, to go back to that word which we were using in the first session. And so it's the whole dying and rising thing which is the source of our healing.
Indeed so. And one of the things I often like to talk about when we're talking about death and resurrection is that you have the language of freedom. The death of Jesus frees us from sin, the old life, the old way of being.
Yes.
The resurrection of Jesus frees us for a new life in Christ, a new existence in God. And actually you need to be freed from and freed for. Because if you were just freed from, then you would be stuck. You need to move out of the old and into the new. And it's the death and resurrection.
And it's that whole movement that we have. And you used the phrase in Christ a few minutes ago. And there's a sense, therefore, in which when we are baptised, when we are brought into that relationship with Christ, it's actually into his dying and his rising, isn't it? I mean, Paul in Romans, the baptismal language and imagery, it's into the whole of that experience that we are incorporated through our baptism into Christ.
Indeed so. And you can't choose one or the other.
No.
You can't just say, I'll have the rising bit, thank you, and not the dying bit. Again, in 2 Corinthians, what we were talking about last week, Paul is very, very clear that you carry the death around with you in the body, because it's in the carrying the death around that new life comes.
Okay, so applying that to where we sit now, we've got the resurrection language, and all that is about new life and so forth, which connects very happily with our images of healing and of wholeness that we've entered into this new state. But at the same time, as you've just said, we're carrying the death of Christ in our bodies as well. So here and now, we're caught, or we're somehow between these two states, or we're carrying both of these states at one and the same time?
Yes to all of that. And it's one of the most complex things of Christian theology. I often like to use the language of paradox, and that there is something about Christian faith which can only truly be understood when you understand paradox, that it is both in dying that you experience true resurrection, and in resurrection that you experience what it really means to die. And holding those two states together is almost impossible for our little brains to do, and yet is vitally important. And so what you get in Paul is that language of the fact that we live now in the old creation. We live in a world which is marked by all the things that you find talked about throughout the Bible, the sin and death and flesh and the suffering and the pain. But the point about Jesus' death and resurrection is that he's opened up a new space, a new way of being, which means that as well as the old creation, we now exist, old creation alongside new creation. And so just as there is suffering and pain and death, there is also new life, hope and joy side by side. And the paradox of Christian existence is how you hold those together in a way that begins to make sense for us.
We were talking in an earlier session about how in Hebrew thinking particularly death is, as it were, the end of a continuum, which is a continuum of disease, it's the ultimate illness, as it were. So by the same token, resurrection might be seen as the ultimate healing. And when Paul talks about us having a spiritual or a resurrection body, that's the thing towards which we are moving, even though we haven't quite got there yet.
Indeed, and there is something about Jesus' healing miracles that remind us time and time again that we are on the spectrum to resurrection. We are moving to that moment when we will receive the resurrection body that Paul talks powerfully about in 1 Corinthians 15.
It's quite a difficult concept, that one, isn't it, as to what that resurrection body, the ultimately healed person, is going to be like. I mean, to take a silly example, though you can't see it when you look at me, I can't see out of my left eye. I carry that with me in this body. What's it going to be like when I get into this new body? Am I suddenly going to have 20/20 vision again, or what's it going to be?
You know, it's one of the most complex questions and everyone always wants to know the answer. And the first response is, we don't know. There is no way that we can know what our resurrection is. It is a mystery. And one of the things that we can do is have a look at some of the resurrection appearance accounts and recognise that it's even more complicated than we thought it was, in the sense that the resurrected Jesus was both recognisable and unrecognisable to the disciples who saw him. So will our bodies look the same or not? Almost impossible to say, but Paul does give us a few clues in 1 Corinthians 15 which I think are really interesting. In that latter half of 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about our bodies being like a seed that you sow in the ground and then changes. And one of the things he's really very clear about is that your body is the body that you need for that circumstance. So the bodies we have now are old creation bodies. The bodies we will have then are new creation bodies. The really interesting question will be what will be the difference? And in terms of whether you will be properly healed physically, 20/20 vision, or if you have lost a limb, for example, will you have a whole limb? In a sense, it's the wrong question to ask. Because one of the things that Paul is very clear about in that end half of 1 Corinthians 15 is the resurrection bodies will be bodies that will be marked by ability, just as all our bodies now are marked by disability. Some people's bodies are more clearly marked by disability than others. But actually, if we're honest, all of us have disabilities in our life. And the clear thing is that come the resurrection, our bodies will be able. Whether that means you'll have 20/20 vision or the person who's lost a limb will have that limb restored is in a way the wrong question. The issue is that actually it won't matter. Either it will be restored or it won't be an issue that it isn't there. And it's the ability which is the key thing.
Is some of that a slight cop-out in the sense of it's something we can say to people who are having to live with the fact that it seems that they're not being healed now, to go back to an earlier session. And so we hold out this hope that, well, it'll be okay one day. Is it a cop-out or is it something we somehow have to integrate?
Well, it probably is a cop-out on the grounds that so often when we hit up against a real mystery that our brains simply can't cope with, we try to come up with something that helps us to make sense of it. I'm pretty confident that come the resurrection, pretty much all the explanations we've come up with for things will be wrong. Because our human brains now for the old creation try to make sense of something that we simply can't comprehend. So yes, it's a cop-out, and yet at the same time it seems to me to be something quite important for us to stay with and to try and to find the words. Because I think the real cop-out is your body will be absolutely perfect come the
Yes,
resurrection.
yes.
Because there are many people, and I'm thinking some of the Paralympians illustrated it very powerfully. Hannah Cockcroft, I remember saying very clearly, she doesn't want to be not in a wheelchair, because being in a wheelchair is who she is.
Part of who she is,
So
yes.
it's a deep arrogance of me to say, come the resurrection, you won't have it.
Yes.
So therefore we can't just say, you will have a body like mine, because maybe that's not the point.
But we hold on to that hope, however it is going to be, that actually we're moving towards this fullness of healing and fullness of life, which we see in the resurrected Christ, but the resurrected Christ who still bears the marks of crucifixion.
Exactly, that's right. And that's the really crucial thing about Jesus' resurrected body, is you would imagine his resurrected body would be completely clear of crucifixion marks. And of course the key thing from John's Gospel is that they are very, very clearly on his body. And so even the resurrected body has death incorporated into it, which is worth us reflecting on, I think.